Yeah, so the topic is going to be, you know, why we believe in God. Is there a God? I think the most convincing evidence for that is the Quran itself, in that it is a scientific miracle. And I'll be presenting evidences from the Quran which will prove that this book is something supernatural based on the scientific information in it. Now, there's two kinds of evidences in the Quran. There's one which is that there are verses in the Quran which agree with modern science, which scientists have only recently discovered. This information didn't exist 1400 years ago. The second one is that the Quran actually corrects the scientific errors of the Bible. And so 99% of the time, we always debate with the atheists, the first one, and we debate the second one with the Christians. But tonight's going to be a little bit different. Um, I gave my notes to Burgis for the second one, but that's okay, because even in that debate, it is a question which atheists have to answer. The question which atheists have to answer is, how do you, from a from an atheist perspective, the Bible is just a book. It's just a book of history, but that book contains many scientific errors. So, regardless of what kind of book it is, the atheists have to answer, how is Muhammad coming 600 years later and correcting these scientific errors? And that's the challenge which I'm going to present to Dr. Burgess today. So yeah, and he's cool with it. He's okay with that perspective, because mostly atheists don't touch the Bible, they don't care about the Bible, and that's fine, But he's okay, and I think he agreed to these terms. So, anyways, let me begin. The first scientific error, which we're going to find, and we're going to well, let me first list them all real quick. You see, in the Bible, you'll see Jesus, or the Bible talks about the mustard seed, talked about meat consumption, it talked about washing hands, it talked about how to treat the epileptic, and it also talks about alcohol. Now, what's interesting is Islam comes 600 years later and talks about those same exact things. So this cannot be a coincidence. What is Muhammad trying to do here? So, as I mentioned, all those issues which I've talked to you about, they're all scientific errors in the Bible. In fact, let me go and share my desktop here real quick so we can look at that. And so if Muhammad was just doing a copy job from the Bible, well, that's a very unwise thing to do, because what's going to happen is you're going to copy over those scientific errors. So let me just go very quickly, and I'm going to breeze through this very quickly. I only got 10 minutes. I'll ask you just please hit pause on the YouTube video to get all my notes. The Bible says that the mustard seed is the smallest seed you plant in the ground. It's the smallest of all seeds. But that's actually not true. We now know that orchid seeds are more smaller. Now, what's very interesting is the Quran also uses a mustard seed analogy. Let's see if he falls into the trap and says that this is the smallest seed. It says inside chapter number 21, verse 47, it says, and even if there be the weight of a mustard seed, we will bring it up. But guess what's missing? You got it. The scientifically incorrect portion, that this is the smallest seed. The mustard seed is not the smallest seed. So you can say, okay, maybe the author of the Quran got lucky. Okay, that's very possible. But let's keep going. The scientific miracle which I'm talking about is not like, one instance, one dodge, as you can see over here. But the scientific miracle here is a consistent pattern of these type of corrections, or in this case, dodging. So let's take a look at a more serious issue. The Bible also talks about alcohol. However, the Quran comes 600 years later and gives a scientifically correct answer to alcohol, and that is, you shouldn't drink it. This is actually what science says, and as a result, there's this recent research which was done, the scientific study, which says Muslim women are 50 times less likely to give birth to a child with birth defects, something known as fetal alcohol syndrome. And that is a direct result of the teachings of the Quran, as you can see on your screen here. So that's the first scientifically correct statement. But the Quran rolls the dice again on alcohol, and it tells us that that there's more harm than good in alcohol, as we can see over here. This is first. Let me go and show you what this from the CNN article. What does science say about alcohol? Many studies have shown that the overall health risks of drinking alcohol outweighs any benefits. Go to the Quran, chapter 2, verse 29. They have some benefits for the people, but the harm is far greater than their benefit. word for word agreement on on the science behind alcohol. So here we see the Quran once again. These are once again dodges a bullet of the scientific errors of the Bible. So because the right dosage really is zero, because you have children, you have women, and so once again the Quran gives a fantastic answer on that. The third scientific error, third scientific error, the Bible removes all restrictions on meat consumption, as you can see from the following article over here. That's not a smart thing to do. Why? Because there's animals you don't want to eat, like monkeys and bats, which those contain, by consuming them, you get diseases such as COVID. COVID comes from the bat. You get Ebola and AIDS, which comes from monkey. The impact is, as a result, all over the world, Christians eat this monkey meat. Okay, and this is a huge threat to mankind, because they contain, because this is how you're going to get Ebola and AIDS, from the monkey. Prophet Muhammad, let's see what he says. He comes now 600 years later and reinstates restrictions on this. And look at what Prophet Muhammad said. He says, Allah's messenger forbade the eating of meat of monkey and beast. Allah forbade the eating of meat of beasts having fangs. So what Dr. Burgis needs to answer here is a man 1400 years ago, in the desert, is giving us the turnkey solution, the preventive cure for AIDS, Ebola, and the coronavirus. If mankind were following this advice that you see on the screen, we would not be having these pandemics. This is the cure and the solution, not just for this pandemic, for also future pandemics. And then we see another example of a scientific correction, and both Jesus and Muhammad's dealing with a child who has seizures. So basically what happened, Jesus looks at the child who has seizures and says, this kid's demon possessed. So here's the problem with that. As a result of that, okay, for the next 2,000 years, as you can see from the following study, if I can find it here, for the next 2,000 years, the epileptics are now stigmatized as being demon possessed, as we can see from Dr. Carl Oten-Nakin's article and his research on this, and others. They all put the blame on the teachings of the Bible for stigmatizing epileptics as being demon possessed. But once again, we see another correction. Prophet Muhammad, an epileptic child comes to Prophet Muhammad. And what does Prophet Muhammad say, as we see in the following hadith? Does he accuse the child of being demon possessed, thus causing this type of horrible stigmatization upon them? Watch what he doesn't say. The Prophet Muhammad simply says, I will invoke Allah to cure you. So here we see something like 4 or 5 scientific corrections to the Bible. So let's now do a little bit of math here. Now, I have more. There's actually a lot more, but unfortunately, I only have 10 minutes. I'll try to get to the other parts, maybe in our discussion. So here we see the question which Dr. Burgis must answer here. Okay, so we were to say, what's the probability of you getting it right like this? I mean, once or twice, yeah, you could say, okay, he copied from some ancient source or something like that. Yeah, I mean, there's no problem there. But you cannot keep getting it right every time. So if we were to say it's a 50, let's just be generous and charitable to Dr. Burgis. We say, okay, look, it's about a 50% chance of getting it right on alcohol, 50% chance of dodging the bullet on mustard seed, 50% chance on dodging the bullet on the epileptic child. If we were to add up all this probability, and I think I've given you something like 5, I think 4. I've only had time for 4. So that's 2 times 2 to the 4th power. That's the problem. Let's see, what did I give you? Mustard seed, alcohol, epileptic, and I'm gonna give you 5. And COVID. So if we were, so that's 2 to the 5th power. That's the probability, and that's going to be the denominator. That's the probability of you just getting lucky each and every time. So why the Quran is a scientific miracle here is because of the frequency, not the individual occurrence. Once or twice, we could just pass it off as nothing, but the frequency of these corrections again and again and again. And this is something which proves that this is something supernatural. Only a prophet of God can correct five, actually, there's six scientific errors, lifting the biblical curse from mankind and setting the victims free. That's what we saw with the case of the epileptic child. We saw that, giving the cure for these terrible zoonotic diseases. That's what COVID and Ebola and these things are. And this is something which is consistent. So it's not just that the Quran is agreeing with science, but the impact it is having upon humanity also as well. So I believe that is my time, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Burgis.
Thank you so very much, Nadir, for your up to 10-minute opening statement. And Professor Ben, the floor is yours for your up to 10-minute opening statement.
All right. Thank you, Nadir. Thank you also to James at Modern Day Debate for setting this up, and Amy for moderating. So at the outset, before I get into the meat of this, I want to just spend a moment talking about why I do debates like this in the first place. Sometimes people who used to see me argue about, capitalism and socialism and war and peace and things like that are surprised when they see a debate on a more abstract philosophical topic like the existence of God, and they assume that I see the topics as linked in a way that I really don't. They're linked certainly in the sense that I believe in the separation of church and state, or mosque and state, and certainly see religious fundamentalists as enemies of humanity. So, for example, I would definitely stand in solidarity with the women life freedom protesters risking their lives right now in Iran. But I have nothing but love for religious progressives, those people of every religion whose faith inspires them to fight for a more just and equal society, and who don't want to use the power of the state to coercively enforce their particular vision of the good life on gay people or pregnant women or religious minorities, are far more my allies than, say, atheists who love Ayn Rand. Many of the protesters in Iran are believing Muslims. So here's the point. I'd infinitely rather people agreed with me about politics and disagreed with me about metaphysics than the other way around. That said, I am a huge philosophy nerd who finds questions like theism versus atheism fascinating. And I find it hugely refreshing to get to spend an evening taking a break from politics and arguing about philosophy. So let's do it. I want to do two things in this opening statement. The main one is to give my positive case for atheism, but before I do that, I do want to say just a few words about Nadir's case for the existence of God. As I understand it, that case goes like this. The Quran couldn't have been written by a human being without the divine aid of divine revelation because of the scientific miracles. That's the premise. So, conclusion, God, and specifically the kind of God worshipped by Muslims, must exist. And I have to say, with all due respect, this strikes me as an almost uniquely weak argument for two reasons. First, the case for that anything paranormal is going on with the composition of the Quran is thin to the point of almost not existent. And second, even if that premise could somehow be established, there's still a massive flying logical leap from there to the conclusion that the Quran was written by the all-powerful creator of the universe. I expect we'll spend a lot of time in open discussion talking about both of these points, so I don't want to take too much time on them in this opening. So we got 10 minutes total, but I do want to hit both very quickly now. First, none of the things that Nadir points to as overlap between the Quran and modern science are anything of the kind. Not specifically saying that the mustard seed is the smallest seed doesn't even show that Muhammad knows that mustard seeds are not the smallest seed, for example. And Muhammad doesn't say, don't drink alcohol because it's going to cause fetal alcohol syndrome. He doesn't say that because he doesn't know about fetal alcohol syndrome. He just says, don't drink alcohol. I mean, harms and benefits can mean anything. And as you know perfectly well, plenty of other alleged prophets and other religions who you don't believe in prohibited alcohol. Did God tell Joseph Smith about fetal alcohol syndrome? Mormons prohibit alcohol. How about the Hindu writers who condemned alcohol in their holy books? And even when it comes to better examples, which again I have to say I haven't heard any in this opening, but if there are better examples, even when it comes to those examples, for Nadir to even begin to make his case, he would have to compare his examples of real or alleged scientific accuracies in the Quran against the large number of scientific inaccuracies other people have pointed to in the Quran. The passages, for example, where the sun and the moon are spoke of as if they're similarly sized objects that both rotate the Earth, putting the Earth at the center of the solar system, or the ones that seem to endorse a flat Earth or a young Earth creationism. I will cheerfully admit to knowing far less about the Quran than Nadir. I don't think I'm shocking anybody there. But even I do know that much. Second, and much more importantly, even if we did have some reason to believe that something paranormal was going on with the composition of the Quran, this wasn't just a regular, unaided human being writing this, which, to be clear, I would say we absolutely do not have any reason to think that. That would still be 100% irrelevant to the topic of tonight's debate. It would actually be far easier, for example, to convince me that Muhammad found out things most humans would discover centuries later by means of time travel or visitations from scientifically advanced space aliens, since however unlikely and outlandish those scenarios are, they're both far more consistent with the evidence we have about what the universe is like than the existence of the kind of God postulated by Nadir. Even an explanation that invoked magic without bringing God into it would be a better explanation than the existence of such a God. And explaining why that is takes us to my larger case for atheism. Now, when I say I'm an atheist, that doesn't just mean that I lack a belief in God. I've always thought that was a terrible definition. My miniature schnauzer Lucy would be an atheist if that was all it meant. What I mean is that I've thought about it and formed the belief that there is not a God. That doesn't mean I claim absolute certainty. Few, if any, human beliefs lend themselves to absolute certainty, but I will admit to being pretty confident about this one. Okay, so why do I think it's so unlikely that there's a God, and particularly unlikely that there's the sort of God worshipped by Nadir? The first, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to lay down a marker here, we can go back to an open discussion, is that all of the philosophical arguments that have been advanced for the existence of God over the centuries, I find really unconvincing. The ones that I think are much better arguments that Muhammad doesn't specifically say mustard seeds are the smallest kind of seed. And even if there was no evidence one way or the other, all else being equal, the simpler explanation would be that there's no God. If I claim there's a tiny invisible leprechaun dancing around on the palm of my hand, singing the flogging Molly song, What's Left of the Flag, at a pitch that human ears can't detect, and the leprechaun can use leprechaun magic to evade any test that we can come up with for this, you wouldn't be agnostic about the existence of the leprechaun. You wouldn't reserve judgment. You'd form the belief that it was extremely unlikely that there was a leprechaun. And that's even if there wasn't any evidence one way or the other. But at least if we're talking about the kind of God that a devout Muslim like Nadir believes in, one who is supposed to be both all-powerful and all-merciful, or, equivalently the God that his Christian and Jewish counterparts believe in, who has the same two properties, then we actually have excellent evidence that no such being exists. A God who has all those properties, philosophers often say all PKG, for all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, would want to prevent children from starving to death, and he'd be able to prevent children from starving to death, but children do starve to death. He'd want to save COVID patients and cancer patients, and he'd want to stop children from being raped, but COVID and cancer and child rape do still exist. As my late grad school professor, Quentin Smith, pointed out in one of my favorite papers of his, even the natural laws that require some animals to inflict massive amounts of pain and suffering on other animals who they kill and eat add up to decisive evidence against the existence of an all-PKG creator. Now, some theistic philosophers have tried to come up with ways around this problem. I know I am running short of time, so I will just lay down a marker here and say that neither references to free will or any of the other creative solutions they've come up with do much to counter this mountain of evidence against the existence of an all-PKG God. Now, I hope we get back to that point in the open discussion so we can actually talk about it because, and with this point, I will hand the floor back to Nadir, if we're going to have a real conversation about whether there's any reason whatsoever to believe in the existence of his God, the discussion is going to have to be about stuff like that and not these frankly irrelevant claims about what's in the Quran. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.